Affairs for Appian Capital Advisory, the Right Honourable Dominic Raab, and Senior Analyst for Trafigura, Henry Van, moderated by Trade Practice Lead for McLarty Associates, Kate Kalutkiewicz.
Dominic Raab.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. I know we're toward the end of the conference, so we're going to make this as exciting and dynamic as possible. And I'm sure you're all very excited to tune into this part, the midstream discussion. The midstream, which doesn't get as much attention as the upstream and the downstream, but nonetheless, obviously very critical. My name's Kate Kalutkiewicz. As mentioned by our intro, I manage the trade practice at McLarty Associates, a global strategic consulting firm which provides advice to multinationals and private sector entities across the world, across sectors, including some in the midstream sector and in the upstream and downstream as well. I think it's really important that we're talking about the midstream right now. This is a very dynamic and changing environment, particularly here in Washington, when we think about how the government is deciding to incentivize new types of manufacturing and investment in the United States. You know, over the past couple years, the past couple administrations, we've seen a very drilled in focus, particularly with respect to US reliance on China across the sector, notably in the critical minerals sector, so in the upstream piece, and in the downstream piece at the other end. And we've seen various administrations, various Congresses, try to drill into this and solve the problem in various ways. Of course, last Congress, last administration focusing quite a bit on the EV sector in particular, in investments and how to incentivize certain buying behaviors to create industrial policy that lasts here in the United States. The Trump administration taking a somewhat different approach when it comes to incentivizing investments in the critical minerals space. But no one's talking about the midstream, and without the midstream, what's the point, right? Certainly in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, we did see a bit on manufacturing tax credits that were supposed to incentivize companies to come and participate in the midstream, but those weren't totally thought through. And even now, we're not sure where Congress is going to go on continuing to fund these programs and these manufacturing investments. And I think we probably can all agree it's critical that the government continue to stay focused on this piece of it. So today, we are joined by some excellent speakers, and I'm going to go to each of them individually and then hopefully have a conversation around this. You know, among the questions I'd really like us to dive into is around this policy imperative on the midstream and whether our policymakers have done enough to incentivize this component. But before we get to that, I want to introduce our panelists. Of course, you've already met Ambassador Yunju, LG Chem's Chief Sustainability Strategy Officer, who just spoke about the security importance of cathode active material before this panel. We've got Head of Global Affairs at Appian Capital Advisory, Dominic Raab, of course, the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and Henry Van, a Senior Analyst from Trafigura, a market leader in the global commodities industry. Ambassador Ko, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
You know, Ambassador Ko, who you just met, is a seasoned South Korean former diplomat who most recently served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Korean Embassy in the United States and as Ambassador for International Relations to Jeju Province in Korea prior to joining LG Chem. LG Chem is, of course, a leading manufacturer of the advanced midstream materials for rechargeable batteries and the IT and automobile industry. It is also significantly contributing to the strengthening of the U.S. midstream processing capacity by building the first ever cathode plant in Tennessee, which I know you just spoke about. So Ambassador Ko, the past few years have shown the vulnerabilities in global supply chains across all sectors. But from your view, what steps can manufacturers in the United States like LG Chem take to strengthen domestic supply chains?
As I explained in my presentation, I think in the United States, the midstream, like LG Chem cathode plant, is the only one midstream for battery the supply chains. So that for the prosper those midstream industries, I think there is appropriate government incentive in place. For example, as I explained the cost comparison among 3 countries, I mean, nobody really had to come to the United States if the United States has need 3 or 5 times higher cost. So that to set up such a midstream industry in the United States, very well designed industrial policy is required. For example, like IRX, 45X, such kind of government incentives mechanism to support production costs over 10 years. This is a kind of initial investment period when have competitiveness in the doing a business in the United States. So I think the well-designed government incentive mechanisms for temporary period, that is a kind of a minimum requirement for making such midstream industry prosperous in the United States.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really important point because we are trying to dramatically change the investment picture in the United States. And I think, obviously, for companies making this hard decision to come to the US, where, as you point out, CapEx, investment costs, labor costs, construction costs, all of these things are much higher than other economies. Without a long-term commitment on the part of the US government to continue with the incentives, the subsidies, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense for foreign companies to make this choice. And so I think that is something, against the context of the IRA discussions and funding, that Congress is hopefully thinking about. How do you see manufacturing's role evolving in the next 5 years? And what can be done to sustain its growth beyond this commitment from Congress? Is it that they need to ensure that 45X is a long-term project and companies can feel comfortable that the investment will continue? Or are there other steps that the US government and frankly our state governments could be doing to incentivize more manufacturing?
I think the most important things are making an ecosystem for all the supply chains working together in collaboration. Especially every country cannot have all the supply chains in a border. So the most important thing is the sourcing diversity is also important, while important, the set of the supply chains in place. On top of that, I think diversity also very important. So that the diversity means, now under the geopolitical competition between United States, China, those period, I think we have to set up the global supply chain based on trust countries among trust countries, so that the diversification of supply chains, also very well designed industrial policy, and making the United States ecosystem for supply chains of the advanced technology industries. That is a kind of foundation to prosper manufacturing industry in the United States.
Great. And I do think that the ecosystem generally is a topic we're going to really get into in the panel. Obviously, we're focused on the midstream, but without the critical minerals, without the customers at the end, again, this is a system that really is an ecosystem that must benefit from each other. I guess the last question really does dive into a bit more in terms of the investment costs that a company like LG Chem has to make to contribute to this manufacturing ecosystem in the US. How would you describe some of the challenges of building processing facilities in the US compared to other markets, and how the broader ecosystem can support you to stay in Tennessee, which is something I think we all want?
I think in the case of the cathode plant investment in Tennessee, we got a lot of assistance from the state government incentive programs. On top of at that time when we make a decision, there is no IRA kind of policies available, but we based on the state of Tennessee's incentive, we brought our facilities in Tennessee, believing that United States is a market for advanced materials, and we are a B2B company, so that there are a lot of OEM automobile companies, and so that we believe customers are clients already in the United States within huge scale. So I think the abundant infrastructure to support the supply chain composition is also important. So government incentive mechanism on top of the providing appropriate infrastructure is very important. And those are the packages should be aligned between state governments, also federal governments.
Thank you. We're also joined by Dominic Raab from Appian Capital Advisory, who leads Appian's international engagement activities, notably those related to the topic of critical minerals. Dominic is a former Deputy Prime Minister for the British government under both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. He was a member of the British Parliament between 2010 and 2024 and held key positions, including Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs and Secretary of State for Justice. Dom, how do the current concentrations of minerals supply chains, particularly in the midstream investor decisions, has this shifted Appian's investment strategy? And actually, before you start, maybe you could explain to us a bit about Appian and the companies that you represent and the way that they look at some of these things.
Kate, thanks very much, and great to join this panel. So Appian's mid-cap, and if you look at the largest players, there's been quite a lot of consolidation. There hasn't been a huge amount of new supply coming on tap. Appian, since 2016, has brought, I think it's 13 mining projects into production now. That's more than the top 5 combined. So to get to why and how, I think it's quite rare for a PE firm to have quite the level of in-house capability that Appian has, geologists, metallurgists, engineers. So for us, long-term risk, CapEx, and maximum rigor is key. So you come back to at the heart of the issue is concentration. This is 20 years coming, so it's not a new phenomenon. And probably the best way that I can explain it in terms of the way that Michael Sherb and the Appian team have approached this is to give an example. Take graphite. You're not going to see all of the US or Western graphite needs coming from the US alone, for sure. I think Chinese control concentration is 60%. I think the next closest is Madagascar or Mozambique, but we're talking down at 5%. So you need to be agile and you need to be smart. I think a lot of the points the ambassador made are absolutely bang on. So we invest in Graphcoa, high-grade graphite mining project in Brazil. Brazil is a really important country and also one of those in between, if you like, non-aligned, both historically and now. But it's a reasonably stable jurisdiction. In fact, we found it very efficient jurisdiction for mining. We extract the graphite there. We also invest in Urbix, a business in Arizona. So it's processed there, feeds the North American EV market. If I try and then take a step back and extrapolate, what are the ingredients for expanding a good project like that? I think there's 2. One is public-private partnership. In practice, and this touches on your open question about what the state of financing is for projects, both at home and abroad. That's certainly in Urbix. We've had some support from the US government, or at least we're selected for a grant. Let's see what happens with that. But the public-private partnership is incredibly important, and finance is important for all the reasons we've heard throughout 2 days here. The second thing is the place of countries like Brazil and other mineral-rich countries and the extent to which we friendshore. I think you used the phrase diversify our high-trust partners. I totally agree. Brazil is an important country. Can it be coaxed to be in a more formal arrangement with the US and Western allies, whether it's the MSP or another arrangement? I think that's important. Of course, the exam question here is how much the US is willing to finance projects abroad with offtake into the US and perhaps jobs down the line in the US. And secondly, what's the extent to which friendshoring is on the agenda as well as onshoring?
And those are both really interesting questions, particularly today, where the president is expected to make a pretty big announcement that might anger some of our trading partners. And I wonder, I mean, obviously the president has focused in his recent critical minerals EO on really, bringing some of this aptitude, this power back to the United States by deregulating, by accessing minerals, in our own country, reducing reliance. I mean, not only on China, but let's be honest. I mean, I think the goal here is to reduce reliance on the world. But in reality, I mean, you look at these things, you look at these investments, how realistic is that for the United States to have any sort of independence on these sorts of issues?
And look, it comes back to a question that I ask every time I go to a conference. Is the goal jobs and onshoring, or is it security of supply chain? I'd love to think that there's actually a reconciliation of both of those objectives. But if you look at some of the things, and by the way, let's also, amidst this debate, be dispassionate about it. It's great to have a US president talking about critical minerals so actively, and the executive orders that come out, I think, have been very interesting. So I think that's a real positive. But if you take two of the areas where the new administration have identified, nuclear and therefore uranium, and critical minerals, if you want more uranium, it's not going to come from the US alone. So the other obvious candidates are going to be Australia, Canada, Namibia. If you want more rare earths, you're going to have to be talking about Brazil, Vietnam, and others. And I think at that point, the friendshoring piece is very interesting. But look, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and many others of the new appointees, amidst the froth and the noise around what's going on, are very well able to chart a course. But I do think we need to see that course. And it's not just the US, it's for Western supply chains as a whole.
Yeah, and I think probably there is an element here to, we can't go it alone. We are confronting, obviously, Chinese dominance in quite a large swath of this entire sector, upstream, downstream, midstream. And really, to combat that, a bunch of market economies trying to outflank a non-market economy and its policies and practice, I think, ultimately is going to be unsatisfying and unsuccessful. And so hopefully one can help that we come back to this notion of friendshoring, but we should talk about that. But back to the midstream, I mean, how do your investors, how do your firms think about price support and stockpiling policies in some of these policies to help support midstream production?
Well, I've just spent some time in Canada, and of course the Canadian G7 proposal around a floor price for critical minerals is interesting, and it's the talk of the town in Washington as well. I guess two questions. One, to what extent would propping up a floor price for any critical mineral be backed by the level of subsidy required? I think that's an open question, both on principle and just reading the tea leaves here in Washington. Secondly, I think there's a genuine question about, even if a means could be found, you do not want to effectively play on China's pitch. Would that just encourage more price manipulation? Having said that, I certainly think there is a case for longer-term agreements, stockpiling, long-term offtake agreements, and within that, long-term agreements with a long-term price fix to see out those spikes in price. And I think that would be very interesting for investors.
And that is a component, I believe, of the White House's EO on the Defense Production Act and the notion of stockpiling. Do you think that's an appropriate role? I mean, it sounds like you do. You think that's an appropriate role the government can play, but to a point. I mean, you don't want to completely change the market, I assume. We'll get to Trafigura because I know your CEO recently made some comments to this effect. But I mean, from your perspective, again, we are market-based economies really trying to play in a non-market space. You're a former government official. What advice would you have given to your government about this and the appropriate place and the appropriate financing that taxpayer resources should be going to do this? President Trump obviously thinks he can do quite a lot of this through deregulation, through tariffs. But do we need the other piece of this? Do we need some of the stockpiling and the subsidies for the rest of the production?
Look, the two principal issues for investors looking in this space are CapEx challenges and long-term stability. If in the end what you're trying to do, given that let's face it, it's not a free market, we're faced against a command economy using all of the arsenal of command economy tools, we can stay pure and say we're not going to engage in any of that, but we will continue to be 20 years behind China and will not catch up. So I think there is a place for trying to allow the market, or indeed create a bespoke market within which long-term investment decisions can be made. But like you, the bit I'd be very nervous about is government picking winners. And I think that's the point at which we need better public-private partnerships. What's the investor lens on this? In all my discussions, the most notable thing is that investors are sort of here, policymakers are here, and we're trying to bridge the gap of expectations. We're getting there inch by inch, but I think we do need to understand the role for government and then the role for business and protect that. Otherwise, again, as you're hinting and I've mentioned, we actually maybe encourage more subsidies, more price manipulation, and that's not a path I think we want to go down.
Thanks. And maybe this is the perfect time to introduce Henry Van. the metals and minerals markets analysis. So you can kind of help us bridge this gap between investment and government, perhaps. Henry Van joins us from Trafigura, where he leads the company's industrial metals analysis. He shapes Trafigura's views on metals and minerals markets and the economic outlook. Prior to joining Trafigura, Henry worked for CRU as a senior analyst, both in London and Singapore, where he focused on aluminum and industrial power consumption. His expertise in macroecon and deep understanding of the industrial metals and minerals market will really, I think, help us dive into some of these things. So, as new players expand their metals divisions with investments in mines around the world, how is Trafigura positioning itself to maintain leadership in the critical minerals supply chain, particularly in addressing the midstream processing gap here in the United States?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me speak today. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for listening. So before I go into that, like really the answer to that question is like, who is Trafigura as a company, right? We are a global commodity trading company, right? We buy commodities, we ship them around the world, we sell the commodities, right? Our focus primarily is on two kinds of commodities. One, energy. Two, critical metals. And today I'm here to talk to you mostly about the critical metals side of the business. We have a very, very large business. We've been doing it for 30 years, right? Our business is a $70 billion business. And I think critically, something that maybe people don't understand is we have so many touch points in the real economy of the world, right? We have over 2,000 unique customers that we supply or we buy different kinds of critical metals from. And not just at one part of the supply chain, really the whole supply chain, right? From the upstream, the midstream, the downstream. So like we live and breathe this as an industry, right? So in terms of like new entrants into the market, we think that our platform, after doing it for 30 years, is broad, is global, and is difficult to replicate. It takes a long time to get the kind of relationships to really understand the global economy from a metals perspective in the way that we do. Now, we operate midstream assets in the US and in other places around the world. And so we know the difficulty that operating these assets has had. And like really, I think from a broad perspective, like if you look at kind of what the midstream has happened out like really in the West and in the US, it has declined really in the last 15 years, right? And the result of that really is the fact that there is another investment model that has replaced the old investment model for investing in midstream assets, right? And this has primarily happened in China, where instead of viewing a midstream production facility as just a factory that you build and you make money from that, the way that China has gone about it is viewed this as critical infrastructure to promote their overall economy, right? To go from upstream to midstream to downstream to eventually be able to produce high-value products in your economy. That is a very different investment product than if you were just looking at building a midstream asset in itself, right? It's a whole other way of thinking. So, in our view, if there's going to be a successful re-industrialization of some parts of the US, really what is needed is a rethink of really how these production facilities are put on. Because the midstream, even though you said it's not talked about that much, is by far the most difficult part of the supply chain to bring into action. I'll give one example. Copper, one of the most important metals in the energy transition, and not just the energy transition, in data centers and everything you can think of, right? It's a thing that brings electricity to everything around the world. Very, very important. The US has a massive natural reserve of copper. That's a very good thing for the US. The reason that more is not mined is because of permitting issues, and I think what the US government, the executive order has come out as really a step in the right direction. The problem is that even today, a third of all copper mined in the US gets exported, right? So it's not just a problem of permitting mining. Really, the even bigger problem from a US perspective is finding a way to not just mine things, but process them domestically in the US. And if that is not solved, then you can permit as many mines as possible. They are all going to get exported to other countries that have better strategies for dealing with midstream assets.
I'm glad you mentioned copper, because we also have an ongoing investigation into copper here in the United States. And so I'm wondering, you know, the Section 232 process in US trade law really does allow the administration in an executive way through the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense to look at all of the issues related to critical materials. Copper is one example. It's, of course, the justification for recent actions on steel and aluminum and autos and potentially more. But in your view, so I'm wondering, as they dig into the copper 232 investigation, which is, you know, moving along here, we can anticipate the president will want tariffs. But it sounds like, from your perspective, we should also be thinking through how to keep the copper in the country, to create competitiveness by also incentivizing new processing facilities. What could the government do, in your opinion, to turn your suggestion, frankly, into a reality?
So I think there's various different ideas that could work, right? One idea would be, instead of permitting a mine, you permit a whole project that goes from mine to processing facility to the next step, right? I think Indonesia gives a good example of a country that has managed to take a very good natural resource and increase the amount of processing that's happened. What Indonesia basically has done is they say, okay, we're going to ban the export of mined product on this commodity, this commodity, this commodity. We're not going to do it today. We're going to do it in 5 years' time, right? Which then every operator of mines in that country says, okay, we have 5 years to go and build a processing facility. And if you don't go and build a processing facility in 5 years' time, you're going to be stuck with a lot of very, very high-valued ore that cannot leave the country, right? So that's one example, right? That's, I'd say, more of a maximalist way of doing it, right? But there's other, let's say, more nuanced ways of doing it, right? Which really is putting forth a project that's not just one part of the supply chain, the whole part of the supply chain, but really it is, I think, viewing these investments as not just we build a mine, we sell the stuff from the mine, but we mine minerals and then we process it. One thing that we say constantly at Trafigura is we talk about critical minerals, but critical minerals are not critical unless you actually turn them into usable metals.
It's a great point. And it also calls to mind, I mean, you mentioned Indonesia. Certainly as the US Congress was writing and passing the Inflation Reduction Act and then regulating and implementing it, we had a lot of challenges and questions, right, around particularly what you're talking about with Indonesia. If you're talking about processing and what qualifies as, you know, something valuable under 45X, our manufacturing tax credit, or 30G, I mean, there were very specific intricacies related to the processing, and they couldn't be done in a foreign country. And Indonesia, I think, took pretty good advantage of that. And the Biden administration, I think, despite its best efforts, was pretty hamstrung by the language in the IRA restricting their ability to negotiate these agreements. What do you think comes next? Do you think that we should be negotiating more agreements with countries like Indonesia or Brazil or Argentina? I mean, is this where we need to go, or should we really focus domestically on building up our own ability to process these minerals?
I mean, from the language of what the administration has said, really the core focus is, you know, on making sure there is security of supply, right? So I don't think it's necessarily just one or the other, right? This is I don't think, a problem that has one solution. It's a kind of all of the above solution to create policy that is conducive to manufacturing things that are quite difficult to make in the US.
Can I jump in? Because I know you wanted to make...
And I welcome anybody to jump in, please.
Look, I think it's absolutely right. Look, the coup diplomatically, let alone for supply chains, of doing some sort of arrangement with Indonesia under a new president, who does want to wean himself off uber reliance on China, it's massive. Now, if you look at something like Indonesia, clearly it wants to go up the value chain. It wants to do some of the refining and processing. But refining and processing, we say it like it's sort of a simple, homogeneous thing. There are all sorts of elements of that chain. Now, it would seem to me that there's scope for a win-win arrangement whereby some of that is done in Indonesia, some could be done in the States, but you then secure end-to-end supply chain. It's interesting, I think, of all the different bits of government to watch at the moment under the new administration, and it's fascinating across the piece. But Exim and the Development Finance Corporation, I think are two of the most interesting, both from the executive orders, but also what's actually happening in terms of their mandate. Is the administration shifting to understand, and is the transactional, if you like, skill set that the president brings actually going to be an advantage in this place? Because the idea of a great deal that actually serves the US in both bringing some of that refining back home, but also securing the end-to-end supply chain would seem to me a great win-win. Indonesia is a candidate. You mentioned all of the ones you mentioned I agree with. Philippines, look at what Saudi's doing. I think Saudi's got a role to play. In the end, though, all of these countries which have got the minerals or the rare earths, which the US doesn't have, are going to want to go up the value chain. So we're going to have to think about what that win-win looks like.
Can I join? Yes, I mean, as I explained in the presentation, like midstream and upstream, like critical minerals, there is nobody in the United States. Actually, cathode plant, we are opening that plant next year, so construction will be done the end of this year. So up to this point, actually, midstream and upstream, there's nothing in the United States. But think about our, the cathode plant. After, next year, we are producing. While in order to produce, we need raw materials, but there is no critical minerals available in the United States. We have to import. As manufacturing, investors in the United States, we still require import the raw materials from Indonesia and Australia. So that I think as long as there are many, critical mineral agreement is possible, is good for the United States, since there is no available manufacturers in the United States for upstream. And then, as he mentioned, there are a lot of technical ways how to control, like local content requirement and financing, like Exim Bank, how to finance those development. And there are many technical assistance support systems to promote such the supply from the trusted supply chain countries to the United States, so that the manufacturing investors like LG Chem get the benefit, and then such kind of similar like-minded companies, manufacturers, they can easily thinking about going into the United States market to invest.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to go back maybe, Henry, to something you said about China's overall approach, and it does sort of lend itself then to trusted friends and allies. If China, as we've seen across sectors, by the way, this is not unique to this particular discussion, but this long-term overall focus, which is very, it's very consistent across the entirety of the supply chain in the U.S. and maybe trading partners, I don't know, but what we've struggled with, I think, is starting with a motivation, maybe sometimes conflicting. I mean, one criticism of the IRA was it was trying to solve many things, and they all possibly weren't working together. One, reduce reliance on China. Two, bring manufacturing to the United States. And three, maybe, tangentially, of course, the climate issues. You couldn't solve for all, right? Because the legislation was not written in a way to enable the administration to solve for all of those things. And then we added onerous regulations related to foreign entities of concern, which had to do with some of the financing. We couldn't do deals with other countries to get the minerals, to bring down the barriers. And so how can they get this right? And this is a question really for all of you. I mean, what specific economic incentives should the US Congress or the US administration be thinking about? What policy mechanisms, maybe not to copy China's successful overall strategy, but how do we bring this all together?
Yeah, I think from a CapEx side, permitting is a massive problem, not just on the mining side, also on the processing side, right? We talk about midstream assets, right? But in reality, these are very big factories that I think most people in the US would not want to have their house right next to some of these factories, right? That is a significant problem from a US perspective, right? From a NIMBYism perspective, right? So there needs to be an understanding that, like, even if we just call it a midstream asset, like these things are these things are complicated processes, right? And that is that's a reality that has to be come with, right? That it's a difficult process that requires an ease to build across the whole value chain. So that's the CapEx side, is build these things as quickly as you can, keep the permitting easy. On the OpEx side, it is a classic thing of anyone who's operating an asset, if you can buy the raw material cheaply and you can sell the output more expensively, you are golden, right? Right now, a lot of the manufacturers in the US, it's the opposite way around, right? Or at least the inputs are very high costs, right? So some strategy needs to be developed to make sure that these manufacturers are some of the best in class from a profitability perspective, and really make sure that that profitability is a sustainable level of profitability.
If I was going to give you 3 on my shopping list to go on what we've all discussed, CapEx, I think focus your financial support very carefully. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, 5 cents goes on mining and upstream for every $1 that goes on EV manufacturing support. That doesn't seem to me to solve the conundrum we're all trying to address. Secondly, the friendshoring piece, look at it from an end-to-end supply chain point of view. If you want to reconcile this security of supply and bring jobs back home over the long term, that's what you have to do. And if that means dealing with Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, Peru, so be it. Thirdly, no one has talked about the OEMs. And we talk about short versus long term, and I certainly, free marketeer to my core, don't want to be availing myself of the the sort of command economy skill set or toolbox. But the one thing China does that we must learn from is long-term perspective. And the OEMs, I think, are incredibly short-term in their view about what actually is going to keep their businesses going for the next 20, 30 years. And I think we've got to find some way of bringing the OEMs and helping them to realize beyond short-term shareholder value that this is absolutely essential for their prospects in the future.
For me, I think the industrial policy and there is a trade policy. I mean, there is always a policy mix. Those policies, I believe, should be mutually reinforcing, not mutually exclusive each other. So in that case, for example, I explained the presentation. I mean, we came to the United States to invest, and this is our first ever midstream factory, and we need raw materials that is not available in the United States, and we need the equipment and machinery to be installed in the newly invested plant. So we have to import. So we have to pay the tariffs. So what about the manufacturing renaissance means to the United States? Our trade policy and industrial policy like subsidies and incentives, they should be mutually reinforcing to make foreign manufacturing companies doing business without any problem. But now it seems like mutually exclusive, like incentives, and we are coming to the United States, but trade policy like a tariff is making really hard, giving us a really difficult time to impose additional financial burden on it. So I believe policy mix should be mutually reinforcing, very well sophisticatedly designed to promote Renaissance manufacturing in the United States.
Yes, policy coordination is always a good goal. It's difficult sometimes in a democracy where parties come and go and policies come and go. But certainly I do think we are marching toward a bipartisan consensus, at least around the notion that we have got to reduce reliance on China. We have to use lots of the tools available to us. I mean, I hope we can have them all be mutually reinforcing of one another and not operating at cross purposes. We've got like a minute left, and we've spoken quite a lot about the US. We've spoken quite a lot about China, but are there any governments getting this mix right in a way that is sustainable to their domestic economy? I mean, of course, China is succeeding, but at what cost, I guess, is probably a question. Are there other economies that we should be looking to as examples, or other governments?
Look, I think lots of other economies are going through a similar challenge. I think Canada is interesting. Australia, in particular Western Australia, is interesting. Both because they're mineral rich, but also have got the wherewithal to incentivize bringing that processing piece back home. But I think the more you look around globally, which is my job to do, the more you realize that no single country has all the answers, and however much we want to try and take mastery of our own destiny, there's going to have to be some collaboration here. And how liberal democracies reconcile competitive and collaborative instincts is going to be, I think, one of the enduring themes.
I guess the answer is that it is China that has really done this amazingly well. And the rest of the world should learn from China. They've really managed, like that country has managed to build an investment model for the upstream and midstream that works extremely well. And I think really what the one takeaway that other countries should do and other policymakers is learn from China. Like learn what worked with them and see what things you could do that China has done that will work for your country as well.
China controls 80% of the midstream processing economy. Can we catch up?
Not overnight. It's going to take years, not months, to change this.
Okay. On that note, please thank our panelists. It was a terrific discussion. Lots to do. Thank you.